Now, you know the title of today's meeting, and I think there has been so much information and noise flooding us over the past couple of weeks and months. So the purpose of today's meeting is, I think, clear to all of us. We aim as an organization dedicated to civic education to create a space to talk about the significance of what is happening around us, and to, above all, support civil society across Europe to just get on the same page. Before we jump to any conclusions, we have to have a shared understanding of what are the basic premises of the world changing around us. And I think a fundamental question that has been posed, especially since January the 20th and President Trump's inauguration, has been how we as Europeans can defend ourselves with less America, perhaps with no America at all, or in some worse scenarios, even against American interests. It might sound dramatic or provocative, but I think it reflects a pretty significant concern about Europe's strategic autonomy and security. And the way I see it from where we stand as civic educators, and me personally as a Bulgarian, there are three fundamental challenges. There is the challenge of culture, there is the challenge of understanding, and there is the challenge of unity. By a challenge of culture, I mean that budgets and budget spendings don't fight wars, culture does. Now, Europe has traditionally been a very reluctant global power, and it remains largely demilitarized. While this was shaped, obviously, by historical reasons, it may no longer fit our present circumstances. The challenge of understanding, in my opinion, is that many Europeans still see the war in Ukraine as a very distant thing, assuming it's mostly relevant to neighboring countries like Poland or the Baltics. But it also affects Lisbon and Madrid and other parts of Europe. And the risk isn't that the Russian army will march to Lisbon, but it is that a lack of unity and shared understanding could potentially erode the confidence in Europe's fundamental structures. And the challenge of unity follows from the challenge of understanding, and it is that the cohesion of the European Union is at stake. So if Russia attacks any European member, the mutual defense clause is then not activated. The entire European Union could begin to unravel. And so a country under threat would be unlikely to support any other major initiatives like agricultural subsidies or Erasmus Plus, etc., without the full solidarity. And so far, we have talked about the war in Ukraine, peace for Ukraine. Now we talk about security guarantees for Ukraine. But I think we have, both probably as politicians, but also we in civic education and civil society, have not talked enough about how the war concerns Europe's security in a convincing way. And so the question to me is, how do we communicate these new and changing realities to our citizens in a meaningful and a convincing way? And this is not a job just for politicians, it is also a job for us, civic educators. And with that, I would like to open the conversation for today. We have invited three colleagues from civil society to offer insights into different aspects of this broader topic. I would like to open the conversation with Rafael Loss, who is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he's based in Berlin. And I would like to have you, Rafael, talk to us a little bit about how and what is changing in the world order that we created since World War II, and what that particularly means for Europe's defense. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Thank you also to the CIVICS Innovation Hub for bringing us all together. Civic educators is an audience I rarely engage too rarely, I think, but it is an important audience. So I thank all of you for joining us today. Maybe I want to sort of kick off my remarks by connecting the issue of world order and the issue of regional order, and going back to the discussions that were happening between the Western allies in the early 1940s, when World War II was still raging in Europe. There were discussions about what the post-war order would look like, both in Europe but on a global scale. And the thinking, to a large extent, and you can look at work such as Danish political scientist Sven Gerst. He recently published a history of NATO that traces the sort of ideational evolution of the alliance. He argues that for the US leadership, in particular, this question of, well, how do we organize order and security both in the theaters of war, meaning Europe and the Pacific, but also at a global scale, together with the other major players and countries around the world, were deeply intertwined. So there was a lot of thinking going on. What does the global level mean? What does the regional level mean? And of course, at the global level, discussion soon centered around the emergence of the United Nations structure as replacing the League of Nations that failed to contain military aggression in the late 1930s and the outbreak of World War II, as you know. And in the European level, there was thinking on how to structure security on the continent, and there were two competing ideas. One of those emerging was sort of the idea of an Atlantic community, a much more cultural, political-based association of nations across the Atlantic Ocean. And the other one, and that was indeed favored on the continent, not so much in North America, was that of a military alliance. The Europeans, of course, emerged from this tradition of balance of power politics. That was something that the United States at the time detested very much. But the compromise was found to create NATO as a political military alliance in 1949, and the European communities, European Coal and Steel Community, and the other associated associations emerging around the time soon after. It's, I think, no coincidence that after the end of the Cold War, and I'm skipping a couple of decades here to progress us through time, most of the countries that previously were under Soviet occupation or under Soviet control behind the so-called Iron Curtain first joined NATO as that political military alliance, and then joined the European Union. The only exceptions are the two latest additions, of course, Sweden and Finland, who had long been members of the EU before joining the military alliance. But the desire for security against Russia in those countries that had the closest experience, of course, with military influence from Moscow, drove them into NATO before considering the European Union. And of course, for the European Union, that was a sensible two-step solution, because the European Union as a peace project, as a civilian and civilizing power, didn't have a strong military muscle, quite deliberately so. And so the question was never raised how the European Union would defend new members. That question was left to the NATO alliance with the United States on board. But of course, that is all changing, and this is, well, briefly bring your attention to a couple of slides on public opinion polling data that my institution, the European Council on Foreign Relations, recently produced. And then I also add some data from Le Grand Continent that mirrors some of the findings that we have had. So we've asked global audiences whether they think the election of Donald Trump as US president is a good thing or bad thing for peace in the world. And here you can see some of the global data we've collected. Quite diverse views, ranging from fairly positive ones in countries of the so-called Global South, towards much more skepticism in European countries, Switzerland, the UK, but also, interestingly, South Korea. A similar diversity of views we found playing out in Europe. with countries such as Hungary being more positive about the re-election of Donald Trump and what that meant for world peace, Hungary being more optimistic and Denmark being the least optimistic about this. These numbers were produced in polls after the US election, but before the inauguration. More recently, and you'll remember the news stories that came out of the White House over the past 8 weeks, the sort of imperial desires that have come to light towards Canada, but also Greenland, efforts to strong-arm Ukraine into signing a ceasefire deal, little effort to also apply similar pressure on the Russians by Donald Trump. Quite the opposite. He's talking about normalization of relations. And so unsurprisingly, mirroring our findings, found in a more recent poll that views of the meaning of Donald Trump for world peace have deteriorated quite significantly. So across Europe, people are now less optimistic than they were only a couple of weeks ago about Donald Trump's ability to advance the cause of world peace. And for us in Europe, of course, that raises a lot of questions. I'll stop sharing. Here we go. Leads me to my third point, and that is the questions that potential US disengagement from European security affairs, broadly speaking, would mean for how Europe organizes security without America, or potentially, as Louisa suggested, even in some ways against American interests. That raises a lot of questions, that raises a lot of very uncomfortable questions, I think, both for European sentiment, European culture, the idea of the European Union as a peace project, as a civilizing civilian power in the world. It also raises difficult questions for national budget prioritization, issues of intergenerational justice. If we take on more debt now to finance increased defense spending, someone will have to pay back that debt in due time. And of course, the biggest question, of course, is the potential for everything we try to achieve to build up a sort of European deterrence force towards potential aggressors, primarily against Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, that these things might fail, and that despite our best efforts and attempts through military, but also diplomatic means to prevent a war, that conflict might be on the horizon, and the warnings from intelligence services across Europe that the timescale for such scenarios might be quite short, means that there's a lot of urgency in those discussions. And you have seen in the recent days reporting from Brussels on the EU defense white paper. We're heading towards a NATO summit that we don't quite know yet how it will shape up, but important decisions being produced there as well. And with that, I look forward to engaging with you on those big questions and to learn from you.
Thank you, Rafael. So maybe if I can just sum it up in a few words. There is ever since Trump's coming to power, there is a growing understanding about a growth of insecurity in Europe, in parts of the world. There is a growing understanding of the urgency, but the questions that we need to face as Europeans are many, and you did mention some of them. They're very uncomfortable, but they go along also maybe the trade-offs we might be having to face between do we invest in more security, and where do we have to cut down on priorities as a union of values, as we like to look at ourselves. I want to now hand over to Daniel Hegedüs, who is working as a regional director at the German Marshall Fund. The impact of the new administration in the United States is obviously not just on the security, the global security infrastructure, but it's been also an inspiration to, I would say, illiberal forces in Europe and across the world. Daniel, if you could maybe speak a little bit about how Trump's coming to power has impacted that, and then maybe in a second bit make the shift over to what's the impact on the broader civic space.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Thank you for having me, and it's really a great honor to be part of this conversation. I'm really sorry for that, but I need to start with a disclaimer that I'm strictly speaking in a private capacity, and nothing what I say is in any way representative to any position of my organization where I work. Having said that, I think I will address repeatedly issues of vocabulary. I don't think that Donald Trump is in any way an inspiration or a source of inspiration for illiberal and autocratizing forces in Europe. I think he's a source of emboldenment and empowerment, and it's much more than purely being a source of inspiration. And potentially, I would like to briefly elaborate on this. Over the past decades, there were two major actors who acted as external constraints for illiberal and authoritarian powers at the global stage. These were the United States and the European Union. We know it very well from political science and international literature that actually international environment matters a lot to democratization and autocratization processes. It's much easier to democratize if you are surrounded by democracies, but it's also much easier to autocratize if you are surrounded by autocracies or the democratic constraints are broken down. I think we underestimate actually the challenge or illiberal countrymen faced over the past 10, 15 years, how actually utterly difficult it must have been to autocratize in the democratic West. It was not easy. And unfortunately, it became much easier after January 20. So after the moment when the United States actually deliberately withdrew from the role of being the global democratic champion, I think this was really the message for populist, radical right, illiberal, authoritarian stakeholders throughout the West that their moment actually arrived. And we see already what sort of dynamics this message triggered, if not necessarily in the center of the European Union or the West, but certainly on the peripheries. We see the police raids in Serbia on civil society organizations' offices. We see actually the strengthening of the sovereignty protection toolkit in Hungary. And we have seen yesterday the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul in Turkey, which clearly demonstrates actually the new situation for the European Union, which is similar to the game of a whack-a-mole, that actually the EU, as now the sole democratic player at the global stage, became much more dependent from the cooperative behavior of its members, partners, and neighbors. And partners and neighbors and also members with illiberal or authoritarian aspirations are exploiting these situations because it's obviously very difficult to enforce rule of law, human rights, or democratic norms if Turkey is actually acting in a very constructive way, for example, with regards to the new security setting in Europe. And obviously, if EU politicians need to prioritize, then obviously they will choose a constructive Turkey at the security and foreign policy field over trying to enforce democratic norms in the domestic issues. The second point why I think that the arrival of Donald Trump emboldened illiberal authoritarian forces in Europe is that actually the dissolution of USAID, and I need to underline that I am not entirely objective here because I also worked as a USAID implementer over the past 2.5 years. But actually the dissolution of USAID signalized for autocrats that now they have practically free hunting license on civil society former USAID partners and implementers in their own countries. This was actually further exacerbated, I think, by the impact of the executive order on radical transparency, which, if it will be implemented in the United States, and they will actually share all the USAID information on grantees, partners, then they will freely deliver all those data and information, what until now actually suppressive regimes need to gather via intelligence means. And I think we can imagine the direct impact of that measure in restrictive environments like Belarus, Russia, Azerbaijan, and what it will mean for fellow civic actors in those countries. And actually coming to the last point, why empowerment? I think this is certainly the most delicate part. But I think what we witnessed over the past 6 weeks is more than just a withdrawal of the United States from being a democratic champion. I am not stating that this is a deliberate policy of the administration, but we certainly have seen members of the administration who were actively working on actually fostering division in Europe. We have seen members of the administration actually interfering in democratic processes in EU member states, may that be in Germany, may that be in Romania, actively and deliberately supporting illiberal radical right forces. And this is certainly something absolutely qualitatively new for European democratic players. And just recently, it's thanks God not on the same level, but for example, we have seen the publication of the joint project of Heritage Foundation, the Polish Ordo Iuris, and the Matthias Corvinus Collegium from my own country, Hungary, which is actually a plan following the blueprint of Project 2025, how to practically dissolve the European Union. So I think we need to be prepared for a new world when potentially former allies also start acting as a source of foreign malign interference into the European Union, even if it's not an official policy of the administration, but at least a policy pursued by some member of the administration or stakeholders in the country. So what's the way ahead? I wouldn't like to go into the details of the impact on the civil society, the region I cover, which is actually the easternmost EU and member states, easternmost EU and NATO member states in Europe, the civil society there. I think if you are coming from the region or well aware, it's a very significant funding gap and actually not a lone-standing negative development, but part of a broader negative trend, how actually both private and public donors withdrew from the region, which used to be the fastest autocratizing part of the whole globe over the past 15 years, with Hungary until 2023, Poland actually paving the way. What I would like to talk very briefly as the closing part of my contribution is the way ahead. We already have been able to witness a significantly worsening operational environment even before the inauguration of Donald Trump. We see a mushrooming of anti-NGO legislations within the European Union. In December 2023, with the new sovereignty protection law, Hungary actually passed its fourth anti-NGO law since 2017. We have similar legislations in the pipeline in the Bulgarian parliament, in the Slovak parliament. These laws are still not passed, but they already have a chilling effect. And we also see a mushrooming, and that's a sign of the breakdown actually of European democratic conditionality in the candidate countries, in Georgia, in Serbia. And aside of that, we also see actually the abuse of transparency legal tools and legislations in a couple of member states and also at EU level. I think for the Bulgarian friends, I don't need to explain this more because actually the lobbying act in the Bulgarian parliament was designed in a way that it's actually making CSO's operations transparent, but actually not the corporate lobbying. And we also have seen since last November how the European People's Party and actually the German delegation in the European People's Party try to use transparency arguments in the European Parliament to undermine European Union funding to civil society, while actually trying to keep business lobbying intact from transparency measures. And my fear is that the developments in the United States will actually put these developments on steroids. And in a couple of countries, this will lead to a very dangerous mix. We see in Serbia, Hungary, Slovakia, huge mass protests, and actually the breaking down of the domestic legitimacy of these regimes. They are facing a domestic opposition they haven't faced, except Slovakia, over the past, not years, but potentially decades. This coming together with an enabling and empowering international environment, this is actually an invitation to try to regain control over the domestic political scene via increased repression. So I hope that I am completely wrong, but I think we are entering a new era of European politics where we will see more restrictive measures that until now we rather have known from countries outside of the European Union. And I'm stopping here, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss the nitty-gritties of these questions. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Daniel. So I think if Rafael's message was we're left to ourselves, security-wise at least, when it comes to the United States, yours is we're left to ourselves when it comes to protecting democracy within the union, but also outside in its immediate neighborhoods. Now we have a very easy task for Sven, who is going to be our third speaker today, try to talk about what civil society and civic educators are the heck supposed to do, knowing that these are two premises that we are probably going to have to work with. Sven is someone who is active in the field of political philosophy and economy. He's a liberal thinker, as he likes to think of and talk of himself, and affiliated with the International Federation of Liberal Youth, among our other things. Sven, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I wouldn't even know myself how to think about it, but I nevertheless try to do it. Interestingly, and without coordination, I think I arrived at the basic assumptions that Rafael and Daniel were talking about before. I think because radical shifts have occurred with seismic implications, I think, for our sector. And maybe just for context, I worked with, in my role as a civic educator, with 50 to 100 NGOs worldwide. I was based in the last couple of years in Belarus, Turkey, now in Iraq. Kind of the battlegrounds for all of these ideas, and I've been warning about what I call the populist wave and the return of geopolitics. So this kind of the domestic challenge to liberal democracy, as well as the challenge to international liberal global order for the last 10 years. And unfortunately, a lot of that has become kind of prophetically true. So now what do we do on a strategic side, or as I said, pragmatic side, as civil society or as organizations that work in the field of civic education or private individuals that work there? And to keep that very strategic, I put a couple of things together that I think would work as a kind of a mental model. So if we want to position ourselves, I think there are three things, like how to think about this from a strategic perspective, an organizational perspective. What are the mental models that I work with? What are the assumptions? And then what are potential avenues to build up resilience? So I will go through them and make a couple of remarks. Again, they are very much applicable to my own reality of my experience of 15 plus years in the field of civic education. Many of you might have very different lived realities, so I'm happy to exchange. But a couple of things that help me and my organizations that I work with to make the assumptions or get the assumptions right to position ourselves. First of all, I think the global backlash to liberal democracy is out there. It doesn't mean democracy itself. I think Daniel has positioned it well with the illiberal Democrats. There's still some democratic aspects. It's not like full-fledged authoritarianism right away. There are some interesting hybrids out there. But what we can assume is that there's a global backlash to liberal democracy, and the US falling is like one of the major major entities out there. So puts this global backlash on steroids, as he put it. Next, on the international level, I think the reliance of institutions is something we have to, at least in our mental model, and that doesn't mean it's reality, but in our mental model, we have to assume that institutions are easily overturned. Might makes right. That's not only true for international order, that those in power make things as they see, but also domestically. That laws that thought will protect us can be going out of the window. The rapid speed of the US administration shows you that institutions can be overhauled by rapid movement. And I think that's something we are not ready. As a political philosopher, I always say, like, in the end, institutions just are words on paper. They believe it. They exist only in the minds of people. That's something we have to adjust, and it will be very hard for many of us. Next one, I think the rebalancing of funds in a warfare state and not in a welfare state, as we are supposed to think ourselves in Europe, is quite different. And the case that civic educators need to make is, how do we contribute to the warfare state rather than to other aspects? So I think the balancing of funds will be a very tricky issue in terms of narrative and positioning. And lastly, I think democracy itself will undergo a long-standing change. As we see in the, for example, study of the Open Society Foundation, I think it's called a democracy barometer, the younger generations are already less upbeat, let's put it that way, about democracy. In general, democracy is seen quite differently with the rise of populism, which is a new form of democratic ruling. So that's kind of the mental model. Whether this always holds true in reality or prophecy, let's keep that to the side. It's just something that I say, as an organization, maybe work with these kind of assumptions. And then what can be derived from this? Well, I think we need to think as civic educators, what does it mean that we are doing? What is democracy promotion after all? I think for too long we have been very comforting with the assumption that democracy is something that is inevitably there. It's a moral framework that we all stand behind. But if you look at the research and like at my own work, we know very little how to actually promote the things that we need for democratic institutions, especially liberal democratic institutions. And so I make it here as concrete as possible. I think even our vocabulary in talking about democracy has been flawed for many years, because we talked about democracy instead of liberal democracy. Now the Council of Europe or other European institutions, what they promote is not the tyranny of the masses, to speak in de Tocqueville's terms, but they promote liberal democracy. They promote the rule of law, human rights, and then democratic decisions, right? This is crucial because Viktor Orban and others understood that very well to attack it. Illiberal democracy is unleashing the tyranny of the people, whatever we define as that, from the rule of law and the human rights. And this puts a lot of things under pressure that we took for granted, but as I said, they might not be for granted. Civic education will become part of anything else in civil society as a shrinking space. I will talk about the repercussions of that as a second, but that's an assumption that we need to make. And lastly, due to the rebalancing of budgets, I think we need to operate as a modus operandi. We have to adjust to a scarcity mindset and crisis mode. And that means in terms of business, we need to adjust how our organizations are run and how the budgets will be allocated. And if we have a constant, at least scarcity mindset, that might help us at least to set up and position ourselves for the future. As I said, I'm based in Iraq or Kurdistan. I very much know how USA cuts have been impacting civil society there. And the assumption that we need to make is that this kind of funding and soft power is gone. It's all about hard power. And that's how we should position ourselves, not next year, but immediately. And I think that is something, a fair assumption from a more practical strategic point of view. So what are potential avenues to give a little bit more hopeful notes, or like at least ideas where we can go? And this is, of course, the million-dollar question. I give you a couple of core things that I think about. First of all, the reprioritization of the civic society sector, or civic education sector, to be more precise. I think a lot of the topics that I always see on high list of our agenda, climate change, artificial intelligence and stuff, these are very important topics. But the main prioritization at the moment is the rollback of democracy, liberal democracy. It is the essence, and I'm German, where I grew up and where I was born, and we know that democracy without Democrats can't work. That was the way that paved the way for the Third Reich. Democracy without Democrats can't work. And that is the bread and butter of the civic education system. We are kind of the upholders of the constitutions and the liberal democratic principles. And going back to this very principle is more needed than ever. That urgency needs to be reaffirmed. No democracy without Democrats. And if we see that rollback of liberal democracy, which I think is at the heart of all of this, then reprioritization might help. Second reprioritization is towards the whole warfare state and security questions. Here, I think we need to make the argument why this might anchor itself to overall security positioning. How does civic education and upholding democratic norms help in that question? And I think that a lot more work needs to be done in terms of our language and whatnot. Diversification of donors. I think public funds will be very hard to get, and that's very bad news. And in lobbying the European Union or European donors to say, we nevertheless need part of this new rebalancing of funds will be very hard, because all the states will be coping with austerity measures, or like at least, these debates at least about austerity. The playbook from the US is there. There are certain illiberal actors within the European Union. It will be very hard. So moving and diversifying funding streams is at the heart of everything. Luckily, the narrative that liberal democracy is also something that promotes economic interests is something there. But for that, we need to be more credible as a sector. In the past, we were to a certain degree, and I felt it as a liberal always, there's a specific socio-demography in the civil society sector, making it more heterodox, making arguments for arguments such as financial education, economic education might help overall the cause to diversify. Reclaiming alternative digital spaces. As I said, like civic education needs to move out of its comfort zone of like hosting events and sometimes even in person, sometimes the digital spaces where people become almost like influencers themselves. That might be one avenue where we can overcome. It's very much if you're pushed to the edges, like that's where you get most creatively. And that's where I kind of close, because we have to get creative. And all of the scarcity mindset might give rise to a couple of things that might push us out of this comfort zone of applying for grants, getting them, relying on public money. I think there are nice, interesting streams that we see, for example, with the Human Rights Foundation. They work with enabling NGOs to work with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to diversify the revenue streams, because private individuals might not be willing to give to organizations the same way that they did if they get targeted in a Soros manner or whatsoever it is, right? That narrative alone might scare a lot of people from engaging in it. And there might be ways where we can get innovative with new technologies to circumvent that. And I'm happy that organizations such as the Human Rights Foundation works in that and enables NGOs. So if you want to sum up what I just said, I think this is not a temporary shift, it's there to stay. Our core commitment is no democracy without Democrats. We need to kind of make our structures more lean. That's maybe the hard news on everything, and operate ourselves as a safeguarder of civic education and liberal democracy. These are a couple of remarks. There's much more, obviously, and that's a very grim picture. I'm sorry for that, but hopefully there was something illuminating in there, nevertheless.
Just like I said after Rafael and Daniel's words, both amazing, but also not. You talked about the scarcity, and I want to circle back to Rafael for a moment before we start collecting or maybe sharing the questions that are popping up in the chat, and just encourage everyone, please share your thoughts in the chat, because I think this is a full room and it will make it a little easier to keep the conversation flowing if I read out your questions rather than unmuting you. So Rafael, if we are to think about scarcity, right? So resources are never enough. Already the European Commission is thinking about where from to fund the new defense plans of for the Union for common spendings. How are we going to convince Europeans who are living in welfare states for some part of them at least? How are we going to convince them that these spendings for more defense are exactly what we need rather than anything else? I think civil society might learn in general to live in the scarcity mode of which Sven was talking But how are we going to do this with the general population?
I think, as is the case with many big questions these days, Ukrainian civil society proves to be an example for how to operate in extremely difficult circumstances with extreme scarcity. Ukraine's government, of course, is forced to spend even more on defense and the military defense of Ukraine, of their country, than Europeans are in any sort of rearm initiative as proposed by the European Union, or defense spending targets by the NATO alliance, or national armament efforts. But we're, of course, in a different situation than Ukraine. And so it's a legitimate question to our experts, as it is to policymakers, to explain what this costs, what the trade-offs are, and how we move forward here. Maybe I think one of the things, again, that Ukrainian civil society has shown is that they can make great contributions to societal resilience. Sven made that point at the end of his contribution as well, that working with the armed forces, but supporting institutions as well, experts and civil society actors contribute to resilience of the military defense of Ukraine, and broader to the sort of solidarity expressions of solidarity towards Ukrainian society, be it in schools and educational institutions, be it in health care positions, be it in infrastructure resilience, and so on and so forth. I think it is important that governments across Europe don't define security solely as sort of military defense. I think if you look at the budget compromise, for example, that the incoming German government found with the so democratic opposition now in the Bundestag, this, of course, is the conservative CDU-CSU unions, and the Social Democrats that are likely to form the next government, and the Green Party in opposition. The other two opposition parties are the far left and the far right. And so it's a slim majority that supports the democratic consensus in Germany going forward. But nevertheless, it's a robust one. And they found an agreement that expands the budgetary space for investments in defense broadly defined. So there's not only the military component that is part of it, but also civil defense and resilience measures, including support for emergency services, civil society-based organizations that support sort of local resilience infrastructure. There's support for intelligence services. There's support for countries that are suffering acts of illegal aggression. This is a reference, of course, to Ukraine. And so if civil society actors can embrace and push for in their respective countries and in the EU for a broad conception of security, then I think that aims exactly at what Sven was referencing, the sort of resilience aspect that should be demanded from governments to respect, but where also civil society actors, I think, can play a proactive role, not only demanding it, but also contributing it in various ways. Again, this question of social trust, I think, is one that we need to arrive at, not only in this critical moment of time for sort of the military dimension of security, but as Daniel mentioned, also for attempts from outside or inside our societies to undermine the liberal values and the rule of law and the human rights that we have come to appreciate and that we take for granted too often. It is indeed a contest that we find ourselves in, even though many of us sort of assumed that the European Union would be a space where contests would be economic and ideational, but maybe not military in nature.
Great, thanks. Daniel, I want to turn back to you. You talked about, if maybe two of the major democracy police forces in the world were the United States and the European Union, now more or less we feel like the European Union is left on its own. So what can we, the European Union is talking about preparedness for some time. The new commission talks about this a lot. And I think much of the understanding is having is having the security lens on, but it also has a broader reading. As Rafael was saying, I think the Commission is also, or the European Union is aiming at defining security not just as defense, but as more. At the same time, when we have to do more military spendings, money has to come from somewhere. So the instinct would be to cut from pots that are easier to cut from. That's culture, that's support for civil society. What is your reading of the European Union's attitudes towards that, and how can we make sure, maybe as civil society or as citizens in general, what is the type of pressure maybe, or what's the message that the union has to get from us so that their definition of security is not purely one focused on defense, but more?
Thank you so much, Louisa. I fully agree with everything Rafael and Sven said in that regard. I think we have a very good mix of where we fundamentally agree and where we slightly disagree in some respects. I agree with Sven that actually the prudent approach is to be lean in many respects. My fear is that from the part of civil society, actually, if it would like to be as lean as, for example, our funding landscape will allow that if it remains unchanged, then we will be seriously outgunned by even by illiberal civil society rising in the European Union, and supported by illiberal member states like Hungary, or potentially after 2027 a new law and justice government in Poland. And against that background, I agree with you, Louisa, that I think we need to try to get a piece of the cake for our work, and I think we need to make it very clear in our advocacy that whatever we do is actually part of a militant democratic response. And as it was said, democracy education is contributing to the resilience and soft security of the European Union. And if I can allow myself to be very cynical, then in this respect, Donald Trump is our friend. Because I think what we will see in the coming months or 1 to 2 years is actually the proof why soft power is important. And the proof that soft power is actually much cheaper than hard power. And even if the United States will try to solve all of the problems with hard power responses, which appears to be the first way of responding of the new US administration, then the world will also turn for them a whack-a-mole game. So in some respects, I think what we see now is potentially not necessarily only a downward spiral, but sooner or later an understanding might come that actually what we do is really essential to protect European democracies. In this respect, I think we also have to reflect on past mistakes. The situation that emerged is actually a consequence of the fact that since 1990, European countries actually de-invested from civic and democracy education. And if it had been in any way even a budgetary priority in education policies, then we wouldn't be here. So practically Germany, potentially Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden are the only countries with a comparably robust democratic education ecosystem. And we see the Austrian case where actually the de-investment from this came hand in hand with the rising electoral support for the radical right. However, I think we also need to be clear to ourselves that the civil society response is part of the response, but it can only be part of the response. So if politics is actually not realizing that it needs to pull their fair share, then I don't think that we can actually change the odds in this game. And therefore, I think we need to find ways how actually democratic political stakeholders and democratic liberal civil society can empower each other at the national or in the national arena at the European stage without compromising the non-partisan nature of civil society. And when it comes to budget, then obviously I think it will be, that's an uphill battle. Now, obviously, we need to advocate for more funding for the Citizens' Equality, Rights and Values program in the next multi-annual financial framework. I think if we achieve equal level of funding, then we have had a strategic victory. Nonetheless, and I know that it's a very, very controversial statement and will be very unpopular, but we need to prioritize. Meaning that I think Europe needs to reconsider democracy support and rule of law support in development aid. We need to reconsider whether we are ready to actually give out more money in the defense of our own democracies instead of promoting democracy, rule of law, or civil society somewhere else in the globe. And we need to reconsider whether it's sustainable that actually, due to the fact that EU member states are not eligible for development aid, for example, the region I cover, and which used to be the fastest autocratizing part of the globe over the past 15 years, there is actually no government-funded democracy assistance and rule of law support because development aid great powers like Sweden, for example, or other countries cannot invest in this part of the European Union. So I know that it's very, very controversial, but I think we need to reconsider the global distribution of democracy promotion and civil society support funding in the future and pay more for our own EU member states instead of investing this money in other parts of the globe. Thank you.
Great, thank you a lot. I think Sven, both Rafael and Daniel touched on points you were talking about. So I'm not going to formulate necessarily a question, but just give you the chance to react to that.
Well, maybe I just reiterate what Daniel said. I think ultimately the decline of democracy or liberal democracy is really at the heart of the problem. And like democracy, and that's why civic education plays such a big role. And that's why it's at the center of this conversation, right? And I think channeling here and making that argument as salient as possible should be at the heart of it. And that sometimes goes outside of just the public funds. I think the diversification of funding streams and like how to make that possible needs to be at the forefront. Now, the United States, through its history, through its charitable giving, so something that de Tocqueville even observed, has a very different structure. Now, the Europeans or the Germans or whatsoever, there's a lot of support for civic education through public institutions. And of course, you can try to make the argument to say, well, now with this new rebalancing of funds towards security and national defense, we just made a narrative that civic education is part of that. That could work, could not work, right? But it would just be, again, an extension of public funding and state's interest. And as a classical liberal, I've always warned about that because the state can also be hijacked like anything else, right? And we saw the Urbanization of the US going on to a certain degree. And we know it in Europe very well, how it can turn for civil society once illiberal forces are in power, as cynical as that sounds. Looking at the restructuring of the Polish civil society after Law and Justice took place, and of course the courageous civil society in Poland pushed back, but nevertheless we see the threats. The threats are not only in Eastern Europe, the threats are even when the center-right government in Germany took over. Now there was a big debate about civil society and defunding NGOs after Merz took over. And again, sometimes for reasons that are very justifiable to the public, okay? And I think here we need therefore to think, what are the diversification strategy? And second, how can we make it a non-partisan entity? That it really at the heart is civic education, upholding the basic principles of liberal democracy. And I think there we really struggle. I think going back to sometimes even rethinking how diverse we are in terms of our political views. Liberal democratic principles are very broad. Making that one of the forefronts might be a conversation starter. But I saw that many questions that I find interesting are in the chat. So I leave it here and I just leave it open to more conversation. But just again, reiterate to get back to the basics to a certain degree.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's posted a question in the chat. I'm going to pick up the first one and just ask each of you to react briefly. One of our friends here is asking if you could simplify your message. What do you think is the one thing that civic educators need to help citizens understand these circumstances? One thing.
I could go ahead if that's okay, or
please go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, well, boiling it down basically also to the foundations of the German civic education, that is no democracy without Democrats. You can have all the institutions you want, but without a culture for democracy, it's not upholding. And that's the case for civic education in any society. No institution can prevent you, as we will now see in many countries.
Right, thank you. Rafael, Daniel.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. In addition to, I think Sven's great message mirroring that, I think the Swedes do very well public engagement on the issue of societal defense. They have this concept of total defense and regularly send to all citizens a brochure with recommendations and asks for the population how to behave in crisis situations, not only referencing sort of times of war, but anything else, a climate emergency, a natural disaster, a pandemic, whatever. But what they underline as sort of the core point of this message is that sending a message to the population that the state depends on the population. I think populations across Europe need to realize, and this is where I think civil society actors come in, that everyone can play and should play a role, that preparedness as a minimum, but deeper engagement where possible is not only sort of fulfilling from an individual's perspective potentially, but also contributes to the resilience of society and the state overall. And of course, that is a sort of civic mindedness, I think that is very close to all of you, but where I think we all can play a bigger role in communicating that to the broader populations in our countries.
Thank you. And my one phrase message would be that the suppression of minorities is always followed by the suppression of majorities. And I think it was a strategic mistake that actually progressive thinking focused on the minorities and largely abandoned the majorities over the past decades. And we have Garvin Welsh with us, and I think he wrote really a spectacular piece a year ago why the response should be refocusing on majorities. But we also need to understand that I think we need to step in the protection of every single minority group now in our societies, irrespectively whether they have or solidarity usually or not. They must have, because they are the test case. And after their fundamental rights will be cut down, or fundamental rights will be the next in the world.
Thank you. There is one question in the chat specifically for Sven, and I'm just going to try to summarize it. So if, let's say, democracy promotion has become a failing strategy, can maybe civic education step back and examine critically both democracy, but also its promotion to kind of salvage what remains valuable?
I think that's very much the task. Yeah, I think we need to critically reflect why the levels of support for democracy is dropping. as we see, not only in electoral results and stuff like that. There are many things going on, but I think in terms of, if you look at, as I said, the democracy barometer of the Open Society Foundation, younger generations are less eager. That doesn't mean that they abolish or like abandon democracy altogether as a desirable political system, but it grants less support, and a lot of it comes with whether democracies can deliver, right? And the question how democracies can deliver is very manifold, and it's the billion-dollar question for any political scientist, but civic participation can play a big role, and the feedback that civic educators can funnel back to decision makers plays a crucial role here, how to make democracies work, right? It's not that the wave of populism is kind of the return to old school authoritarianism. It is a kind of a hijacking of democracy to a certain degree, because it has become too bloated and not be able to often deliver on core issues for people. And I think that will come out more and more. So I think it is the role of civic educators to funnel that back to decision makers, and lastly, like to really shape how we want to see democracy. And that means also where the public discourse is going and the like. So I think you're spot on, and I think that's the role actually of civic educators, to think about these basic pillars of what is democracy, because it is not a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, and I think that's how it has been treated, and I think Daniel has also talked about that. It's like kind of became almost inevitable for everybody, but nothing is inevitable, right?
Thanks. Then I'm paraphrasing again. There is a question in the chat which I think might nicely fit to you, Rafael. Basically saying, how can the European Union quickly strengthen its cyber and disinformation defense mechanisms, especially against Russia, given that there is a lack of youth-friendly platforms and apps in Europe?
That's a very big question, and one that the EU has struggled productively addressing for some time now. But there are EU programs, as there are national programs, and even the NATO as a military alliance contributes to them to some extent, to build up cyber defenses, to build up resilient information environments in the countries that are parts of these organizations. But where we're often too slow and too playing catch up effectively with the disinformation actors. And that's just simply, I think, a fact of any information environment, that fact checking doesn't work. It doesn't work at scale, and it doesn't work at speed. And so you have to get ahead of the disinformation and misinformation. And this is essentially where societal resilience plays the biggest role, civic education for media literacy, political education, and so on and so forth. I think it relates back to the points that Daniel and Sven made, but recognizing that, of course, we're moving towards a situation where funds are more scarce, and where this is only to get more difficult. But I think a growing awareness among policymakers that we are indeed in a time when even the fundamentals are being contested, as Sven made clear, where democracy can't be taken for granted, where liberal values can't be taken for granted, despite us having sort of come accustomed to that for some time.
Thank you. I'm reading out loud, or basically trying to summarize another question in the chat. Has the European Union's focus on, so to speak, higher level goals like socioeconomic development and the environment caused it in a way to neglect more basic security needs, creating in a way a debt that now demands a stronger European security capabilities? And so are there other debts arising in this fast-changing global landscape?
Maybe I take this one as well. Look, this wasn't inadvertent. This was quite deliberate, as I mentioned before. There were successive decisions that led to NATO being the primary provider of security and defense capability in the Euro-Atlantic area, and the EU playing a civilizing role, focusing on especially those soft power instruments, on human development in Europe and abroad, and sort of integration or peacemaking through integration and association integration internally and association in the eastern and southern neighborhoods, and then development cooperation beyond those areas. So that was a deliberate move, deliberate choice by European policymakers over the course of generations. But it is one that requires, I think, now a course correction. It's not necessarily the EU as a club of 27, because as Daniel and Sven have mentioned, there are actors that hold veto power in different formats that would constrain the EU at 27 in foreign and security policy. And we've seen this with various sanction packages towards Russia. We've seen this with Ukraine support packages. Each time Hungary played an infamous role, but with the US withdrawing and with the US political leadership withdrawing from Europe, I would expect other actors to sort of come out of the woodworks as well and be more assertive in their opposition to sort of traditional European foreign policy goals. So what we'll likely see is the EU playing some role, a contributing role, a servicing role, but coalitions of the willing around sort of a core of European governments that need to include not only EU countries, but, for example, also the United Kingdom, Norway. Daniel mentioned Turkey's role. I think to some extent the tension there is becoming more evident every day, with Turkey as a security contributor, but also as an autocratizing society, putting big questions to European policymakers. But I think that is the way Europe as a security actor will evolve around those kinds of coalitions of the willing, where more defense capability is needed.
Thank you. And we have one more question in the chat, and I think, Daniel, maybe you can react to that. It relates to the relationship of civic education and defense organizations like the army. Do we need to reshape that relationship?
I think it would be rather a question for Sven as civic educator, but I can share my 2 cents. Yes, we can rethink, but with my civic background, I would be happier to see your role in strategic communication, because I think Europe hasn't only been under-delivering in defense spending over the past decades, but particularly in strategic communication, explaining societies actually the challenges they are facing. And potentially just adding one thought on the previous points. Yes, European societies, of course, Rafael is right that it was a deliberate diversification of tasks between NATO and the European Union, but European countries have been free riding on NATO and especially United States military spendings over the past decades because it was comfortable. And I think it would be a very, very hard task for any European political player to convince European societies about the opposite, that more had to be invested in defense. I think simply our threat perception was very underdeveloped because in our liberal worldview, we thought that there is actually no threat to European security. There is no threat to the existence of pluralist liberal democracies. And I think that threat perception was fundamentally wrong. So where I would see more role, potentially is just a limitation of my understanding, that we shape that threat perception in the future a bit better as part of societal level strategic communication. And of course, that needs to include security-related components as well. Thanks.
Sven, I also want to give you the chance to react to that, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So thanks for asking that one about the relationship between civic education and defense organizations or the army. I can share, to make it as practical as possible, the example that we have in Germany and that I worked with, and that is the German army actually has a specific component just for civic education. So a specific parts of the army are dedicated to that, and they go to schools. They also work together with some of the political foundations in Germany, so that's kind of the core pillar of civic education. And they do, for example, week-long simulation games. So in case you want to look that up, it's the Polis game. I can link to it in the chat. And they go to schools and make them understanding geopolitical dimensions and security questions and the dimensions that go hand in hand when it comes to international relations. We as civic educators work with them together. We design our own simulation games. We do it for adult education. We don't only go to school. We do it with political leaders. We do it in an international context even. So there is already these kind of best practices, and I think we need much more of that. But again, like this kind of engagement between the civic education part and the army is taking place. And again, I will link to some good case study from the German experience. I am sure it exists in other countries, but I have taken that on, and we did several educational events in the past where we went through that, and I can highly recommend to look into this.
Right, thanks for the recommendations, all the great ideas. I can just encourage everyone to post ideas in the chat as you already do. We have one more questions, and then I'll be going back to just asking you for your final words. And that question relates to growing civil societies in exile that are connected with authoritarian countries. I understand it in a way that these are representatives of that authoritarian regime, if I understand Alexander correctly. So what do you think of this model? Should Europe have a specific strategy in this regard? I'm not sure, honestly, if this is, if that means civil society in exile that is like a legitimate civil society, or rather representing the authoritarian regime. So if any of you has a better comprehension of the question and feels addressed by it, please go ahead.
Thanks. Very briefly, I think this is partially happening. So if we take a look on Russian exile, democratic exile, exile from Belarusia, then they have organizations which are supported in an organized way by EU member states, by the European Union. Obviously, there are significant challenges, I think, attached to this type of work. One is impact related. So the question is, what's really the influence of this exile actually on the Belarusian or Russian society? And the second one, how far it can be actually penetrated by intelligence services from these countries, posing a threat actually to the rest of the exile, but also to the host country in several cases. Notwithstanding this, I think it's a very low-key investment in actually keeping alternative political elites, democratic alternative political elites for these countries alive. And in many ways, actually, it could also ease pressure on the European Union if there would be more investment, and potentially could try to destabilize in some way these authoritarian regimes. I'm not hopeful in this regard, but because I think the Belarusian and the Russian regime has a very tight control over information spreading in their societies, but certainly there are opportunities. If we are speaking about EU exiles within the European Union, for example, I'm also part of such an exile, Hungarian living in Germany, and I think we have seen some particularly impactful moments. So, for example, the 2020-2021 demonstrations in Romania, where actually the Romanian exile has played a very significant role. We should invest in transnational learning in that regard, and also helping exiles, Romanian exile, Hungarian exile, living abroad, to play a more significant role in pivotal moments of the country, because that can be not necessarily a game changer, but at least an enabler for political change in the case of these countries. Obviously, going back to our core question, it's the resource question, and I'm not optimistic that this will be actually the topic on which EU member states or the European Union will spend taxpayer money in the coming years. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Before we move over to closing today's event and making some announcements, since this year's festival that our organization is holding in Oslo in September under the title of Hope, I would like to ask each of you for one final closing word of hope. It can be a sentence, as long as it's hopeful.
What makes me hopeful is, again, going back to Ukraine civil society and the resilience that they've shown, that they show a path of agency, that we have a choice, that we have agency to improve our situation when it comes to security. We just need to take the steps.
Thank you. Sven, Daniel?
I'm an overly optimistic person as a Hungarian working in this area after 15 years. But actually, the fast maturing of the European political elites over the past 6 weeks made me hopeful. So it made me the impression that under pressure, it might be the case that even Europe can deliver. So if it remains in this track for the next couple of years, then I think we will be just fine.
Well, and German philosophers are usually really on the pessimistic side. I mean, that's what they're literally famous for. But on the hope side of things, I build upon Daniel. I think pressure will change also the sector. And I think civil society and civic education, I wouldn't say has been complacent. That cannot be, with always being understaffed and underfunded, but it will make us more innovative in terms of the edge of society. And I think we can learn from the Taiwanese and the Ukrainian, as Rafael has said, like there are some really innovative civil society structures out there, and the pressure will hopefully move us there.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think in the wrap up to this event, we'll do a little blog post where we also share the different references you have quoted today. So colleagues who want to have a look into them can do so and get inspired by the examples you were able to give at the end. Apart from sharing information about the festival upcoming in September, you can find more information about it also on the NECE.eu website. I also wanted to share with you an upcoming campus event in April that is touching upon some of the things that particularly Daniel talked about. And this is lessons from countries where there's been recent attempts to pass foreign agents registration legislation, but also more. And there is a link to that session in the chat. With that, I am calling this meeting officially over, and I'm very grateful to Rafael, to Daniel, and to Sven for taking the time to join us today, but above all, to all of you who are trying to make sense of the current situation and see what the impact is on our work as civic educators. I hope you leave the meeting more optimistic, more hopeful, and a little more inspired as to what comes next. Thank you so much. Enjoy your evenings, and we'll see you very soon, virtually or in person somewhere across Europe. Thank you.